In this section of the course, we're going to talk about composition, which is a key element when taking a good photo. When it comes to composition, if you take only one thing away from this section, it's to consider your positioning or viewpoint when taking your photo. Your left to right, high to low, close to far position to your subject will have a significant impact on your image. Subtle changes to this can make your images more interesting and focused. The elements that you exclude from your images are just as important as the ones that you include. Excluding the right elements can allow for a lot more focus on your subject. Consider how you can capture unique perspectives. For instance, you can try flipping your iPhone camera upside down when you take a picture in order to move the camera lens that much closer to the ground and capture an even lower angle shot. One of the quickest ways to improve your composition with pet photography is to get down to their level. This can make your photo feel more engaging and can allow you to capture some great expression. There are many different compositional guides in photography. We're going to look at 3 popular compositional guides that not only help as a beginner, but also apply to taking pet photography. The first one that we're going to look at is the rule of thirds. Then we're going to look at layering and then isolation. The rule of thirds breaks an image down into equal thirds, both horizontally and vertically. This guideline suggests that elements placed along these grid lines, particularly where the grid lines intersect, will produce a better composition. This rule ultimately encourages dynamism in your images and allows the viewer to have a more engaging experience with the photograph, scanning more areas of the frame as opposed to taking a picture where your subject is dead center. By turning on the iPhone grid in the default camera, this can help to use this guide while you're shooting. You can do this by navigating to your settings, then to your camera section, and you'll see a toggle to turn your grid on. Once you turn this on, going back into your camera, you'll see that you now have a grid overlay that shows you the rule of thirds. These lines can also be very useful to getting a straight horizon in your images. When using the rule of thirds, the concept of looking room is quite important. As a rule of thumb, you should try to give your subject empty space in the direction that they're facing. This gives them space in the frame to look ahead. Otherwise, insufficient looking room can create some tension in your image. Too much looking room can also add unnecessary tension. This is where using a guide like the rule of thirds, where you place your subject on one of those grid lines, really comes into play and can be helpful. The next technique, which is layering, breaks an image down into separate layers as foreground, midground, and background. When we take an image, we are replicating a 3-dimensional environment onto a 2-dimensional plane. When we do this, we lose a lot of the depth and dimension that we naturally see in our world. By using a technique called layering, we can reintroduce some depth and dimension back into our images. Layering is a technique that breaks the elements in your image into foreground, midground, and background. The foreground are the elements that are closest to your camera. The background are the elements that are furthest away from your camera. And the middle ground are all of the elements in the middle of your image between your foreground and background. By placing elements in more than one layer, you can add a lot more depth and dimension. You can use this in 2 slightly different ways. Elements can be placed in distinctly separate layers, which is going to emphasize shape and form, or they can be placed to cross through your frame, which can allow you to pull your viewer's eye through your image. Isolation is a very important concept to know and use when taking pictures using your iPhone. The iPhone's default camera is wide, and it has a deep depth of field, which simply means that there's a lot of elements that are in focus. Knowing this, a lot of elements are going to make it into your frame, and most of them are going to be in focus. By reducing the amount of elements in your frame, you can simplify your compositions and focus your viewer's attention right on your subject. You can use this technique by shooting toward an empty background or a far away background, or you can get closer to your subject. As your background gets further from your focus point, it will lose focus and become a blurry background. This is quite limited when using an iPhone because of its deep depth of field. Even still, by getting really close to your subject and having a very far away background, you can still get some blurred backgrounds. You can also try using something like the portrait mode on your iPhone's default camera. Your iPhone is using computation to determine what the subject in your image is and what parts to blur out and what parts to keep in focus. This means that sometimes, and I've found oftentimes, the iPhone can kind of miss the mark and blur certain parts of your subject or have certain background elements still be in focus and can sometimes just ruin a good moment. I generally like to just stick to the default iPhone camera. I know the limitations of having a wide, deep depth of field camera, and I'm okay with it. But if you really want that blurred background look and all you have is an iPhone, then using the iPhone's portrait mode can help you achieve that. As we wrap this section up, it's important to note that compositional guides are not hard and fast rules. They simply help guide you to better framing and better placement of your elements in your image. It's common as a beginner to photography to place their subject dead center in the frame every time. Sometimes that works, and sometimes that is the answer to the composition, but it's good to know some of the other ways that you can compose your images and experiment with your composition and framing. It's important to consider not only what's in your frame, but also what's out of your frame. Maybe you're excluding an element that would be the cherry on top of the image, or maybe you're including elements that really should be excluded in order to focus the attention on your subject. Lastly, explore and experiment to find the best composition. Think about your positioning and think about your viewpoint. Look beyond your subject to see what's in the background and if there's any distracting elements or ways that you can slightly shift your angle to get a lot more focus in your image. In the next section of this course, we're going to continue the discussion of capturing pet photos using your iPhone, but we're going to specifically look at how to use light as a tool.